Welcome to the Missions Podcast, the show that explores your hard questions on missions, theology, and practice to help goers think and thinkers go. I'm Alex Kogman, Director of Communications and Media with ABWE, coming to you from our Harrisburg, Pennsylvania International Headquarters studio and beaming over to the California studio of my co-host, Scott Dunford, pastor of Redeemer Church in Fremont, California. If you have the great pleasure of looking at the video version of this right now, as I myself can see you, Scott, looks like you've gotten your own studio upgrade.
You know, that was something my wife wanted to get done for me, so that was something she did for my birthday. And as you're going to get, those of you who are watching, get to see the benefits of that. It's a lot better than just the plain white wall.
Well, every good thing that happens in our life as far as productivity is usually spurred on by our wives. That's true for me as well. And I do have to ask you, since it was just your birthday, how does it feel to be 39 again?
Oh man, I wish I don't know if I wish that. I'm happy to be 46. I've earned every year, so I'm thankful for that. But thanks for that, Alex.
Well, that's actually a good segue to what we're talking about here today. I mean, we talk about all sorts of theological, cultural, missiological things. Sometimes we dip into sociology, and a big piece of sociology is the generations. And even you and I, Scott, our friendship there's so many interesting dynamics there that have to do with me being a millennial, you being an Xer, and the worldviews that are shaped because of that. Or maybe you and I are just weird. That's entirely possible. Scott, why don't you introduce our guest and our topic, because it's related to all of that and mobilizing the next generation for the work of the Great Commission.
I'm very excited to welcome our guest, Dr. Jolene Erlacher. She has devoted her life to studying and teaching on leadership dynamics, especially related to multi-generation. She's written several books, Millennials in Ministry, The Daniel Generation, Godly Leadership in an Ungodly Culture, and the newest book that's just coming out, Mobilizing Gen Z for Missions, which I think she can give us the details of when it's being released. I think it might have already been released, but we just want to go ahead and welcome you. Welcome to our show, Jolene. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Scott and Alex. It's so great to be here.
Jolene, as we talk about this issue of generations, one of the things that comes up is, how do you define that? I mean, I've heard some people talk about, hey, we look for markers, 9/11 marks millennials maybe, or my daughter, she's born in 1999, so she's right on this, the straddling of these different generations. So you as someone who's done a lot of work on this study particularly, what are the things that you look at of what defines a generation? What do we mean by that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the way I like to look at it is really looking at three factors: life cycle effects, period effects, and cohort effects. And life cycle effects are kind of those things that all of us experience based on where we are in our life cycle. So young people tend to be more optimistic. We tend to think that we have more answers. We kind of know it all. And so that's kind of a life cycle effect that we know kind of is when you're a young adult, you kind of have those perspectives. Period effects are how significant events like the Great Depression, a war, 9/11, a pandemic impact you based on the period of life that you're in and how it impacts that group of people because of how they were living that period. So something like, 2008, 2009, the recession impacted millennials much differently than boomers, right? Young people who are looking for jobs versus boomers who lost a lot of their retirement savings or pension, those types of things. So that's a period effect. And then cohort effects are the trends that really inform our worldview as we're developing. And so those three factors kind of combine to help us see, how does a group of people or a cohort share some of these things: life cycle effects, period effects, and cohort effects. And that then creates kind of a generational cohort. Because of the life cycle effect, we've tended to make generations like 20-year grouping, right? Because that's kind of what you see the life cycle effect playing out as. But given things like technology and other factors right now, there is some debate if a generational cohort is actually that long anymore. It's actually probably getting a little bit shorter. So that's where you'll see some people say millennials are actually kind of two groups: older millennials and younger millennials, just because of some of the things that technology kind of infused into their growing up experience.
Whether you always had a cell phone or whether you remember getting your first cell phone, that kind of thing.
Exactly. Yep. And then how things were conveyed to you, how you learned to communicate, how you took in information, what things you were exposed to because of technology as a result of having that or not having that.
Well, speaking of technology, we've got a note here from a listener. Her name is Dolly, and she has a question for Jolene. She's wanting to make sure that you don't take her man. So I don't know
Oh
if
my
you want to
I've heard
respond
this
to
one
that.
before.
Actually, that in itself is probably a generational Rorschach test. For if you didn't understand that, then this episode is about you because we want to hone in particularly on Generation Z. So there you go.
I don't know, Alex. Dolly spans generations. She's kind of in that Johnny Cash
That's
territory where
true.
everyone, if you don't appreciate and love Dolly,
Yeah, you're not
might have
even
a problem.
alive. That's right. That's a good point. So now, and that's good. You just saved my inbox from getting blown up with all the Gen Zers who are in Dollywood right now listening to this as we speak. So let's move past that. And what are some of the benefits you'd say, Jolene, of studying generations in this way? Because just like with missions in general, sometimes we can be too sociological, too precise about things that scripture isn't clear on. But what are some of the benefits for you, especially thinking in terms of ministry, in terms of mission, of studying generations, splitting things up in this way? You're not just splitting hairs, there's value that you see to it.
Oh, absolutely. So, I mean, I grew up as a missionary kid, so I'm a third culture kid. So I tend to see things through that cultural lens, that cross-cultural lens. And I really see the benefits of studying generations in the same way that we see benefits in studying cultures. Because across cultures, often we have behaviors that we don't always understand why people are behaving in a certain way until we understand their worldview or their values, right? And so it becomes very easy to misunderstand or misinterpret or to engage in a way that's not as effective as possible if we don't understand those values and worldviews below the kind of cultural norms that might be there. And the same thing is happening with generations. They have different worldviews, different values, and sometimes behaviors can be misunderstood, not engaged effectively when we don't understand the worldviews and values behind those behaviors. So I think that really is the benefit of understanding generational differences, because often we're doing something out of the best intent, but is perceived not positively. So a great example of this would be millennials who came of age during the recession and were having a hard time finding jobs, paying student loans, all of that. They saw people who worked for 20, 30 years in a job getting laid off and having no other networks, no other job skills, and really struggling. And so millennials look at that and they're like, I'm not going to work for 20 or 30 years for a company. I'm going to diversify my skills and my network. And that is responsible. That is good. Networking, that's good diversification of my skills for me to be effective in the workplace long term. But an older generation might see that as being not committed, not having longevity or resilience in the workplace. And so that's just one example of how a worldview or a value might be perceived incorrectly if we don't understand generational differences.
That makes sense why sometimes there's conflict in ministry, and we're going to get to those questions a little bit later. But so help us understand, because we've obviously, those of us who are my age and older, the Xers and the Boomers, we've probably done some studying on millennials. That was talked about so much, especially as such a large generation. And now you're writing on this next generation that's coming of age right now. What are some of the big differences you're seeing between Gen Z and the millennial generation, especially the younger millennials?
Yeah, I think there's some really key differences that are critical in ministry context. So one of the things we saw with millennials is millennials are very optimistic, very idealistic, very committed to a greater purpose than themselves, being a part of a community, being collaborative. And so as we thought about engaging millennials in ministry context, those were some of the values that really resonated with ministry, settings. Whereas for Generation Z, they've grown up in a period that's been much more overwhelming. They've lived through 2008, 2009, watched parents struggling with finances and jobs. Now we've had the pandemic and just a lot of other things going on in our society. And so Gen Z has really grown up in a time where we've prioritized safety and we've communicated kind of a culture of fear that you need to be cautious. Yeah. And so we see Gen Z much more focused on security, safety. They're very individualistic. So they're collaborative, but they want to be unique. Whereas with millennials, we saw them kind of being collaborative and wanting to be a part of a community. And so these are some of the differences. So whereas millennials might have been more, apt to take risk or jump out and have an experience, Gen Z is much more reserved, much more cautious. They're very pragmatic, and they want to be happy and secure because they've been in this world that feels very insecure. And part of that is technology, right? Even more exposure to technology and exposure to things going on in the world has made them feel less secure. So I would say those are some of the significant differences. And then technology and how they've engaged technology is also critical, right? Because Gen Z has had technology. They've had a digital footprint from before they were born. Whereas many millennials, it wasn't until they had a little more control of their technology that they started to have a digital footprint. So that's impacting some of the differences as well.
I want to follow up with that just a second. Do you see as those generations age, as you've been able to look back and study and say, hey, Gen Xers obviously were one way in the 90s, but now that, we're in the 2020s, they're acting differently. Are you seeing that with millennials? Do they become less optimistic as they get older, or do some of those same traits stay solid?
Well, we do see some of those life cycle effects, right? So the life cycle effect is you tend to be more optimistic when you're younger, you get more realistic as you get older. But I would say overall, millennials still are more optimistic than maybe Gen Z is right now. And that's where Gen Z is breaking some of the molds, I would say, because they are not optimistic. They are very overwhelmed. Many of them are depressed and anxious and not hopeful for the future. And that's not just in the US or North America, that's globally. Many Gen Zers are feeling discouraged. But with millennials, I would say some of the trends are changing a little bit because of the life cycle effect. Once millennials are managing Gen Z, they start to see some of the perspectives of the Gen Xers who are managing them. So we're seeing some of those things play out. But in general, millennials have held to many of their values that they had. They still are very purpose-driven, value community and collaboration, those types of things. So some changes, yes, but still a lot of things that are there as part of kind of their generational values and worldview.
Well, Jolene, I'm winking at our producer who's Gen Z. And of course, Scott here, once upon a time, was my boss at ABWE. So X to Y to Z, what you're saying definitely rings true. But I do want to bring this home a little bit to the idea of missions mobilization, because I think that this is all incredibly fascinating. But I think mobilization is the perfect vignette for where some of these problems collide with each other. You mentioned the idealism of millennials, right? Under the millennial generation, things like cause-based marketing became a thing. Think of Don't Waste Your Life, John Piper. Maybe that goes a little bit more into Gen X, but those things were certainly becoming more and more influential and picking up momentum throughout the 2000s as millennials were coming of age as well. And so that's really what someone in my generation would have experienced as they became awakened and became a little bit older and more aware of the need for missionary activity worldwide. I don't see, and I think the same applies to, Radical, David Platt, Francis Chan, Crazy Love, all the books that people were reading 10 or 15 years ago that were inspiring people to become missionaries or just kind of hate their life and feel guilty for whatever they're not doing, right? But there was sort of a wave of those maybe in the first 10 years of this century. I'm not seeing, and this is just me personally from my chair, my perspective is limited, but I don't see that following wave coming in this decade, in this generation among Gen Zers. Is it there and I'm not seeing it? Am I wrong to not see it? Or am I correct in that a lot of that was potentially a byproduct of the idealism of that generation? And now that we're dealing with a generation that, whether because of technology or world events, is anxious, depressed, confused, and a little bit isolated, are we not seeing that because of those factors?
I think, yes. To answer the first part of your question, I do think that those are a response to kind of the millennial worldview and values. And I don't think that they are resonating with Gen Z, which is probably why we're not seeing as much of that messaging today. I think Gen Z is firmly a part of a postmodern culture now and a post-Christian culture, a post-missions culture. I talk about that in my book. Yeah. They have grown up where deconstruction is a part of every aspect of their lives, right? So they're deconstructing things from a very young age to look at all the flaws and everything that didn't work. We live in a culture of fear, a culture of blame, and a culture that fears failure and teaches them to fear fear failure. So as a result of that, they are very cautious about stepping out and doing something when they've looked at all of the things people have done that have not been perfectly executed, right? And where things have not gone exactly the way maybe we wanted them to. And that's true in the missions world. It's true in the church world. It's true in many contexts. And so they are more paralyzed to step out and act because they've grown up in this culture where they've seen people blamed. They've seen failure. You get canceled if you fail, if you say the wrong thing, do the wrong thing. And so that message of step out and do something great, sacrifice without thinking through, how is this actually going to play out? Is this the best way of doing it? Is this something I really want to be a part of? Is this the best use of my life? Are all questions that they're asking. And then you put that with anxiety and some of the other issues that they're dealing with. And this is a generation that can very easily be paralyzed without the support of leaders and coaches and parents and others who are coming around them and supporting them, because they don't have that impulsivity that I love about millennials, right? To just jump out and do something great when they're given that vision. So my co-author, Katie, she likes to describe it. When we were mobilizing millennials, we painted a picture of a need and said, go be a part of solving this need. With Gen Z, we're really having to paint the picture of how they specifically and uniquely can help be a solution to solving that need. So it really is more individualistically focused and giving them hope that there's something in them that can make a difference in this world and that they can succeed, communicating that belief that they can succeed.
So you began to answer my next question. So unpack that a little bit more. So if the challenges are what we just described a minute ago, what are the opportunities with Gen Z? We know the ways that they might be harder to mobilize. What are some ways that there would be an open door to see them mobilized and sent into the mission field?
I think there are some really powerful things that Gen Z are bringing right now. One is just that Gen Z is very globally minded. They've been connected globally since very early years. And what we're seeing is actually the emergence of a global youth culture today, where young people globally relate to one another better than they relate to older generations in their own culture. And so Gen Z is used to thinking globally, and they're used to connecting with people globally. So I think they're already kind of positioned to be engaged that way. The other thing is that Gen Z has grown up in a culture that has taught them tolerance. So tolerance is really the number one value for Gen Z today. And it's not always positive because it's sometimes not defined just as understanding and respecting others, but it's sometimes defined as understanding, respecting, affirming, accepting, and celebrating everything all the time, which can also be paralyzing because it can make it hard for them to have a sense of personal conviction that might contradict someone else. But nonetheless, it has created a generation that's very open-minded, that understands there's a lot of things for them to learn, that they can learn from other people, and that they should be listening and engaging other people. So I think as we think about the more global movement that's happening in missions today, Gen Z is well positioned to engage in that global movement. The other thing is that Gen Z is bombarded by all these messages, so much information, and they're hungry for people to come alongside them and help them process the information that they have and process what it means for their life, process what they believe about it. And so there's a lot of opportunity for us as leaders, as mentors, as pastors and parents to come alongside Gen Z and really engage them in a way that's going to be meaningful and it's going to deepen their understanding of who God is and who God's calling them to be. But it requires us to change our methods because we're used to giving information, and Gen Z can access a lot of information on their own these days. Usually what they're needing from us is space to process and interpret the information that they had. So if we're willing to do that, we have a really powerful opportunity to equip this generation to really step into this period of history that I think is really pivotal as we're seeing the shift to what I would call the global age of missions. And I think Gen Z is well positioned to step into that.
Well, what you said about global youth culture, I've seen that. We had a student stay with us for about a semester from China, and I've got 3 xenial teenage boys. And when he walked in, it was interesting. They all watch the same shows. They all are interested in the same things. And a lot of times there's subtitled shows that are taking place in Korea or Japan or somewhere like that. And of course, and then American things as well. But they had a lot more in common with each other than I would have ever guessed because of that global youth culture. That was really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I'm in Mexico right now, and today I had a Gen Zer here teaching me how to do videos for like TikTok. And I'm like, it's the same world, right? It's the same world that our
Yeah.
teens all over the world are engaging on the same TikTok videos
Yeah.
and conversations. And so it's such a different dynamic than even just 20 years ago when millennials were younger, I should say.
One of the issues we've dealt with, Alex and I, as we're talking to older missionaries, especially, in the missions world, you've got these teams of missionaries that have been serving for generations, right? They put in the labor, they're hard workers, they've suffered for Jesus, they're deeply in love with Christ. And then younger people come in with very different values and very different perspectives, especially when they go to some of these, least reached places where, life is difficult. So when you think about the ways of connecting these older generations, what are some of the ways you've seen older generations connect with Gen Z that are effective? And then, are there any best practices you can recommend if you're, especially to our older listeners, someone my age or maybe even older that's trying to learn how to disciple well or welcome new teammates in a way that would help them to thrive?
I think one of the things that's most disorienting in many contexts as we're engaging across generations is the different perspectives on respect and how we gain or give respect. So traditionally, respect was often gained and given based on title, experience, and education, maybe even age, right? So that's if someone had a title or they had experience, we would automatically give them respect based on those things. And some of that was based on the fact that those people had access to information and influence. The reality is today is that a 13-year-old can have more information and more influence than I have as a 43-year-old, right? And so those are not it's not the same world anymore. I mean, I have my doctorate and I can be teaching my students and they can be Googling the most up-to-date research on whatever topic I'm teaching on and know more about the topic than I do at the moment, right? So it's just a whole different dynamic. So what we're seeing is this shifting of how we gain respect and a voice to speak into other people's lives. And it's primarily based on relationship today. So relationship is the currency of respect. And that means we have to take time. It takes energy. It takes emotional investment. So it's a lot more work. But what we find is that the older adults, the leaders who will take the time to cultivate a relationship, they gain the respect of young people and earn the right to speak into their lives. So we talk in the book a lot about relationship and how that has to be developed. And the reality is that young people today, they are connecting with people all the time, but it's in a very superficial way. So Gen Z is the loneliest generation alive on the planet right now because most of their connections are very superficial. And we know that a screen does not allow for emotional connection. And so they are hungry for emotional connection with others, but they don't always know how to do that. And so it requires a lot of humility, a lot of patience, and a lot of role modeling from the older generations to really step into the life of a young person. One of the things I've realized is we have to model so much humility because Gen Z feels like they have a lot of information. So they often feel like they know a lot, right? And we just have to have the humility to come alongside and sometimes just nod our heads and then ask questions instead of tell them the answers. So we talk a lot about coaching as well. And coaching is, at the very basic level, a good coach approach to leadership is asking open-ended questions and actively listening, then asking another question and actively listening, and not giving them the answer, but providing the place to process, the space to process, and asking the right questions that help them get to the answer that they need. It really comes back to teaching them how to fish instead of giving them the fish. And because today they have so many fish, right? So much information coming at them all the time, they haven't always taken the time to learn how to process and think deeply. So we're seeing a decrease in critical thinking, problem solving, those types of things, because they're not taking the space to process. So I would just say to older leaders or those who are mobilizing and encouraging young people, really hone those skills of asking good questions and actively listening, being truly, truly invested in the life of young people. And that is what opens the door then for that relationship and that respect to be able to speak into their lives and encourage them.
Jolene, I love what you're saying, and it rings true anecdotally, at least in my experience and connections that I've had with people.
Yeah, mine too.
I don't have access to the same hard data, but it seems true. It makes sense. Before we dive a little bit deeper, I want to talk about what we can expect from the current generation that's coming of age now, what we can expect going forward. But before we get into that, there's something that we didn't really touch on. We talked a little bit about how for the current generation, in many ways, to embrace, to affirm someone, or rather to accept someone means to affirm them in every way, right? To tolerate them means to celebrate everything about their lifestyle. Obviously, the LGBT movement comes to mind with that. But that's an interesting case study, if for no other reason than you mentioned that they're very individualistic. And yet that's clearly a tribe. There's clearly a tribal affiliation there. It does come down to the individual, but I see also a lot of fervor around belonging to a tribe, belonging to a group, belonging to a movement, identifying as something, and then finding an internet community full of a bunch of other people that identify with that particular interest or affinity, no matter how far off the beaten path that particular set of interests is. And that's if it's innocuous. That's not even thinking of things that are really harmful that you can find community around as well. So is there any way that technology would maybe cause us to nuance our view of Gen Z as leaning more individualistic versus wanting more community as perhaps millennials did?
I think the key difference for Gen Z and why we say they're so individualistic is because they're a generation that's being told they get to choose who they are and who their tribe is.
Yeah.
So I think about like when I was born into my family, my region, my culture, my language, my gender, whatever it might be, I kind of received an identity. And it wasn't that I couldn't do some things to establish more aspects of my identity, but we kind of in the past received our identity. Whereas young people today are being told, you get to choose your identity. Right. And you get to choose who you are. So that's the very individualistic piece of it. And then because of technology, you can connect with a tribe that is who you choose to be wherever you are. In the past, we didn't have that. So if I didn't connect with the identity that was right around me, with my family, my region, my culture, my church, my school, whatever it was, I didn't belong. And then you saw the tribes within, local schools or whatever emerge. But today, the difference is they're being told you get to choose who you are. And then because of technology, you can find a tribe that fits that choice. So that's the very individualistic piece of it, is that sense of choice. I get to choose my identity.
And that seems very fluid too, where it seems like they'll be a part of one group and then be part of another group. And whereas it seems like even in the LGBT area, they seemed like they were firm boundaries and everyone was fighting for fixed boundaries. Now it's fluidity seems to be the word of the day.
And let me just mention something there, because I think that's a very, very important point. Because they're also being told that you get to base reality on emotions, story, and experience, versus in the past we based, reality on facts, logic, and reason. And so in this world of reality exists in my emotions, my story, and my experience, it is very fluid. That's an excellent point. And I want to just highlight that, because for leaders out there, to remember that identity and decisions and all of this is very fluid, and often they're processing these things. So they might make a statement about something that we're just like, where is that coming from? Why are you saying that, right? I've talked to so many parents who their Gen Z kids have come and made a statement about something that they believe or that they feel. And the parents who can just do that coach approach, right? That relationship, sit and ask those questions and listen to them and discern what God is saying and doing in their kids' life and walk with them, often see some of those things change, right? As they help them process and they gain a better sense of maybe what is truth, not just their emotion. So I just want to throw that out there for leaders. Like, remember that it is fluid. And if we can step into that space with them and help them process, we can often help them land on the truth that is outside of maybe their current emotions.
Let me just follow up with that, because that's hard as a leader, it's hard as a parent, when the person you're leading or trying to influence or coach makes a bold statement that you feel is unorthodox or maybe lead them in a very dangerous direction. But I've seen the same thing you're saying, that with patience and leadership and good questions, it is pretty amazing how often those ideas are really quick to move off of. Whereas I think when I was younger, I would hold my heterodox, for lack of a better term, opinions to myself until I had fully cultivated it. And then when I brought it out, I was pretty sure that this is where I was at now. I'm going to say heterodox.
You didn't immediately make a TikTok video about it.
Right. No, because I felt like if I made a statement about it, now I'm in that camp now. So I had to process that very differently. So that makes it tough for leaders who aren't thinking about it this way to not read their own experiences into the younger generation. Do you think that's accurate, Jolene?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think it is hopeful, right? Because sometimes young people today are making a lot of statements because they're just responding on emotion. And for those of us who grew up, I grew up in the same period as you, Scott, we can kind of get panicked and overwhelmed. And I think just remembering we don't have to respond that way. We can just walk with them and watch the truth kind of emerge in their experience can be really hopeful.
Even what you're talking about right now is so fascinating because I can relate to that somewhat as kind of a digital native, grew up certainly with more technology, remember getting my first cell phone, all those sorts of things. But there is an extent to which in the information age, you kind of try on an idea for size, maybe take it into a few arguments, even if you're not fully convinced of it yet. And Scott, I know that I've never done that. I'm just saying hypothetically. Certainly never done that on this podcast, but leaving that aside, let's talk about how some of these more foundational kind of realities of human experience do land on a generation as they're coming of age. You talked about life cycles, right? Some of these things are cyclical. So at some point, by the grace of God, I don't want to presume on this, but by the grace of God, at some point, a portion of the population that's believed, for instance, that gender is completely fluid, they're going to wake up. They're going to realize, here am I, 75 years old in this body, and it never changed, and I am who I am biologically the way God created me, right? For instance, just using that as a springboard, a jumping off point, what are you expecting to happen in Generation Z? How might things change? How might they develop and grow so that we as pastors, leaders, missionary mobilizers can be ready for that and can be ready to help them take steps into serving the Lord, knowing Christ, first of all, but then also serving him on mission as they develop in their maturity?
Yeah, you make a great point because really what we see in history is pendulum swings, right? And even within generations, we tend to see pendulum swings. So you see the boomers and the millennials were very team-oriented, collaborative, positive, optimistic generations, and Gen X and Gen Z are more the pragmatic, cautious, maybe cynical sometimes generations. So you see some of these pendulum swings throughout culture, history, generations. So there is this point of like things kind of swing back the other way eventually. What I think with Gen Z that I really sense is happening right now is that we have what I like to call the season of a remnant. I talk about this in my Daniel Generation book, just similar to, in Daniel's time, how we saw the fall of Judah, the exiles go into Babylon, and you saw this remnant there that really were faithful to God. They listened to what God was saying. They were discerning of their times. And then when the time came to go back to Jerusalem, rebuild, they really had laid the foundation, right? There were people who were ready to go back. Daniel had prayed, and people had prepared and they were ready to go back. And so I really feel like right now what we have with Gen Z is really a Daniel generation, a generation that is kind of in exile. They are on the margins of society if they believe in God, in God's truth, and they are going to be marginalized in many ways. They already are being marginalized in many ways. And I think what we can do as leaders and pastors is really equip the remnant. I like to also call them a seed generation. So my family's from the Midwest originally. And, back in the old days, you would harvest your crop and you would eat off that crop for the winter, but you would always set aside the seed so that when the spring came, you had some seed to plant in the ground. And today I often find missions agencies and churches are just desperate to get their numbers, right? We want to have those numbers we had with the millennial generation or the Gen X generation. But really what we need to make sure we're doing as well is really equipping those who are already there, making sure we're taking the time to deepen their theological understanding, deepen their sense of identity of who they are in God, so that when things shift in our culture and people start to realize, okay, some of these things that we've been saying are not working, right? This is not okay. This is not what we wanted. There are people who are prepared and equipped with the answer to rebuild some of the things that maybe have been torn down in our culture. So we have to really make sure we're focusing on that remnant, the Gen Zers who are showing up, who are hungry, who want to participate, but maybe don't even know where to go because their peers and the culture around them is so confusing. And they need leaders who are going to take the time and the energy to really equip them to be prepared to lead in the future.
So obviously there's so much more in your book than what we were able to mine. What are some other things in the book that viewers say, hey, if someone picks up my book, these are a couple things that I think they would find very helpful there and maybe encourage people to go out and get it?
Well, so my newest book, Mobilizing Gen Z for the Global Age of Missions, just came out August 8th. And in that book, it's kind of broken into a couple different parts. So the first one, I kind of talk about this post-Christian, post-missions world we're living in. Then we talk about the Gen Z traits that are emerging as this generation has grown up in that world. Then we really look at the mobilization strategies, and that's where we really break down the relationship, the coaching, the motivation that they have, and how do we really come alongside them. And one of the things I really appreciate about that section, that my co-author really did a lot of work in that section on just specific coaching questions, giving examples of what these conversations can look like that they need. Often we're finding young people might be considering missions or ministry, and then they go home and, a grandparent or a brother or sister or cousin or mom or dad start to poke holes in all their reasons, and all of a sudden their emotions start to feel negative, right? And they're like, oh, I have negative emotions. That means something's wrong. Because remember, emotions determines reality in this postmodern world. So they start to think, oh no, these negative emotions mean that I'm making the wrong decision. They go back, or they ghost the agency, or they ghost the pastor who's mentoring them, or whatever. They just stop responding because of those negative emotions. So I really appreciate, we've offered specific types of questions to frame those conversations, to how do you help young people process some of those things, to really determine what is God calling you to do, and how do you gain confidence in that so you can walk forward. And then another thing we really talk about in the book at the end is just the need for some innovation in our methods, especially as we think about retaining young people in missions and ministry context. So sometimes we're doing good on the mobilization side, or we're doing well on the mobilization side, but then we're not following up on the retention side. So just some of the leadership strategies and the need for innovation in some of our methods is covered in the final section of the book. So that's kind of just a quick overview. My favorite part is the end of the book, because we really kind of offer what I like to call cheat sheets on just Gen Z traits, a quick assessment for your organization on, are you doing these things that will help Gen Z connect with you? And then just those questions that can really help you engage them in this whole process of walking with them into their calling.
Now, even something you said in that is so useful, that this idea that negative emotions means red alert, I'm doing something wrong, redirect, because that determines reality. If there's anything that we need to lovingly, relationally, long-term work to deprogram our brothers and sisters of the up and coming generation in, it's that idea, especially if they're going to be useful in ministry or on the mission field, right? Suffering is normative. Another thing that you said earlier that I thought was really relevant, that I think this would be good to bring up, is the fact that the best way that we can sometimes serve them, especially if they're considering a decision about missions, is just with space for processing all of the information that's flying at them. At ABWE, we have this event called the 24-hour demo. It's an open house. It's a preview where you come, you interact with missionaries, and hopefully you leave with a plan and some next steps about what your role is in the Great Commission as a goer or as a sender. And if you were to ask me what the greatest value proposition of that is, well, you can get a lot of the content from those sessions in video form, and you can interact with a lot of those missionaries on Zoom calls and Microsoft Teams calls and things like that. The biggest benefit to being here in person is unplugging from your regular life, getting on a plane and having processing space here and over a table with food, with fellowship, with people that are like-minded and in a similar space. And that's why the 24-hour demo is so useful. And so I think there's so much here that's incredibly practical. How can people get a hold of the book and other things that you've written? What's the best place for them to go on the web?
So leadingtomorrow.org is my website. So everything's there, leadingtomorrow.org. The book was published by William Carey Publishing. So their website is missionbooks.org. So you can also access the book there or get bulk rates and such through their website. So those are the two best places to go.
Very good. Well, thank you for joining us, and thank you for watching or listening. The Missions Podcast is a ministry of ABWE. To get more content, go to missionspodcast.com. You can partner with us, and we'd highly value that at missionspodcast.com/support. To learn more about ABWE, head on over to abwe.org. The best way you can show your support for this ministry, though, is by leaving a positive rating and review. That'll help get this content in front of other people that can be blessed by it. So we'd ask you to do that and find all the ways to follow the show at missionspodcast.com/follow, including by video, since we're now on ABWE's YouTube channel and on Facebook as well. You'll catch it in video format every Sunday night at 7 p.m. And so until next week's installment of the Missions Podcast, thank you for watching and listening. We'll see you next week.